Hi everyone, how are you doing today? First, I want to start by thanking Heather for engaging with a topic that I had mentioned in one of our comment sections about violence in fiction. And this is a topic that I've asked a few people, friends, family members, and so I'm kind of like doing the rounds here and getting different people's perspectives on it because I think it's a fascinating question and not the easiest one to answer, I don't think. So I'm just going to make some tea here, my very elaborate tea making ceremony, and talk about this because it's been on my mind a lot recently. And I just kind of want to continue the conversation. And if anyone else wants to chime in the comments or on their own video, feel free. So I think that, conversations of this nature can come across as a bit supercilious or holier than thou. And I want to make sure I'm not doing that here because I don't, that's not the point of this. I'm actually really just interested in different people's perspectives and kind of formulating my own on this topic of violence in books and movies and so on. So I would also say that there's a few assumptions and things I'd like to address as a starting point before I kind of get into my take on this. First of all, I think it matters. I think words matter. I think fiction matters. I think that nothing's just fiction and nothing's just words. So I don't know if that makes me a snowflake, but if it does, so be it. So I take it very seriously, content in books, in films, and I include that as part of my assessment of something. Not as much as I used to. That's a whole nother tangent. But I definitely take it into account. And so some other things maybe I'll just get off the table before I start. Obviously, I think most people would agree that there's such a thing as age-appropriate books. So what I'm talking about here is books for adults specifically. And I also believe that when it comes to nonfiction, accuracy should be paramount. So I don't believe that nonfiction should be sugar-coated if it's dealing with topics of a violent or otherwise, disturbing nature. And ultimately, I do think it comes down to personal preference because, as with so many things in literature, there's just so many ways you can evaluate and slice it, and no pun intended. There's so many ways you can look at it that, at the end of the day, it does kind of come down to personal preference. So one of the motivations too for me is just my world outlook, my religious worldview. Try to focus on the good things in life, right? Like try to fill your heart and your soul with the good things, and don't focus on the bad things unless there's a really good reason to. And indeed, there are often and frequently are very good reasons to. We want to understand the world better, have empathy for people, and make a positive difference where we can and not be out of touch with others. Getting straight to the point, violence in fiction. A few things I want to think about are purpose, proportion, and just the mode in which the violence is delivered, if you will. I actually had difficulty finding books with graphic violence on my shelf. I found a couple, and again, it's not like I don't have the Lord of the Rings or anything, but I'm talking about truly graphic, detailed violence, which you really see more in the 20th, 21st centuries, not as much before that. Not that it didn't exist, it just wasn't as acceptable to write about. So The Sea Wolf comes to mind. This was a book that I read sort of twice. Like the first time I didn't finish it because it was a bit grim for me. And then the second time I just absolutely, I read the whole thing and I thought it was fantastic. But there are scenes of animal abuse in here as well as abuse towards humans by the tyrannical Captain Wolf Larsen, appropriately named. This was sort of one of my first books where I kind of crossed crossed a a line that I'd previously drawn and decided that it was okay for me to read this. And I think that, with Jack London's writing, there is always an element of sensationalism, which I will get back to later. But I do think that it serves a purpose in this book in terms of helping you understand this character's complete lack of morality. He doesn't even really have... It's more that he's amoral than immoral, if that makes sense. Like, he's just kind of positioning himself as above morals. And the narrator, this Humphrey, is trying to combat that more on a philosophical level, really. Although ultimately he has to stand up to the captain, or decide if he's going to, right? So yeah, this isn't going to be a review of the Sea Wolf. This is just one example I wanted to draw from the shelf. Another example is The Sea and Poison by Shūsaku Endō, which I have a review of this that I need to repost on YouTube. I read it several years ago. This has some really disturbing scenes in it because it is about Japanese human experimentation in World War II. So it is historical fiction in the sense that Endō wrote it after World War II, but he didn't write it that long after. He actually, this was published in 1958, which is pretty, given the subject matter, I would say it was pretty soon after. I think this is one of the greatest books I've ever read, by the way, but it is incredibly dark and violent. There are scenes in it which I just can't forget because they are that disturbing. I think this is one of those books that actually, the lines between fiction and nonfiction are so blurry that it's really hard to say, well, Endō crossed a line here, or, it's just one of those pieces of historical fiction that is so poignant and so deeply personal in the way it's written that, I don't know, I would say that this is a book that I think where the violence was justified and can hardly be avoidable just due to the subject matter and the points he's trying to make in here about how people treat each other and how, standards of decency just drop in times of war and in times of prejudice. So, yeah, these are the two books that I had. And I don't know, I feel like I've read other things. There is another book I will mention here in a moment that I no longer have on my shelf. Again, this becomes more of a topic in 20th, 21st century literature and also in film, obviously. I've watched some pretty gruesome movies, not necessarily intentionally, but like Snowpiercer comes to mind, where I thought it was just, I felt like the violence was over the top. So let me get to that. What is crossing a line for me when it comes to violence in fiction? And I think what it really boils down to is whether the violence is objectifying or voyeuristic. So the example I wanted to bring up here from recent years was Blindness by Jose Saramago. This is an apocalyptic / pandemic themed novel about a place that becomes hit by this white blindness. Really a great premise for a book, perhaps not the best reading during the pandemic, which is when I read it, but frankly, a promising start to a book. So I thought so. I thought the beginning was very well written, and he wrote in this style that was, I would say, fairly staid, and I mean, not terribly graphic or anything. And then somewhere in the middle of the book, there is a scene of horrific violence that, Saramago just changes his whole writing style and gets, pornographically detailed in what he's describing. And I just thought that was very strange. It was obviously off-putting. And I felt like, as a female reader, it was going so far that it seemed to be objectifying and very uncomfortable to read. I kind of regret finishing that book, but I ended up finishing it because I did not want to be called out for having not finished it and leaving a bad review. But that's a whole nother topic we could discuss. But what I'm trying to say here is that in that book, the violence was graphic to the extent and in a context that just seemed so wholly inappropriate, and just it really left you questioning what he meant by putting it in there in that way, when the rest of the book wasn't nearly so detailed on anything, frankly. And I don't even think it was that helpful because, well, first of all, I just ended up skimming those parts because it was just way too much. It was just too much. But also, people have imagination, right? Readers have imagination. And I think he could have easily developed the same sense of horror without needing to say so much. And a good example of this, a book I could have got off the shelf and neglected to do, is Lord of the Flies. Lord of the Flies has all kinds of horrific violence in it, but a lot of it is either off stage or it is handled in such a way that you are forced to fill in the blanks with your imagination. And it is no less horrific. It's just told in a different way, in a way that puts the autonomy back in the reader's hand, in the reader's imagination, really, instead of imposing these strangely, inappropriately detailed things upon you. So that's where I think giving the power to the reader is the way to go, if you're a writer. And I realize that my threshold might also be a lot lower than other people's, but that's just kind of my rule of thumb these days. And then when it comes to personal preference, obviously I'm not seeking to read books about violence. And I think violence against women in particular, or children, I'm very sensitive to. So we'll tend to avoid books that have that. But as far as more of this objective criteria about what I think is crossing a line, it's just that. It's that objectifying manner of writing that just really bothers me. And that could be also the case with books that aren't about sexual violence. Maybe they're books that are about other kinds of abuse, and just to the extent that, you're left wondering, well, was it really necessary to go into such graphic detail? But, again, a lot of this does boil down to personal preference. Some interesting things that I've heard from others in these conversations. I was talking to Nigel, my brother, and he was drawing a distinction for himself, personally, between violence that's between sort of equal forces, if you will, versus violence against innocent people that, are unable to defend themselves in any way, and how the latter made him feel more uncomfortable than, other kinds of stories where you've got more of an equality in the combatants, if you will. Another friend was talking about how in some books the violence is there to make a point. I think we can say that very much so about, these two books here. And then the question becomes, well, at what point does the book make its point, and does the rest of the violence become just unnecessary after that? And I think that was also a good point to make. All right, so that's actually a lot more than I meant to share. I think that, it's just a topic that's been on my mind, and I think we see it a lot more with media becoming more violent because it's become more acceptable. I'm thinking of certain TV shows that have become popular over recent years. People aren't shocked anymore if that's part of a TV series or even a book. So let me know your thoughts, and take care.